Hello everyone, this is Suzanne at The Gospel Truth. Today is Sunday, November 12th, and I decided today that we are going to start reading a book called The Hiding Place. It is the life story of Corrie ten Boom. Now, my generation grew up hearing of her. Maybe some of my daughters, but after that, I think a lot of the younger people have no idea of a lot of our history throughout the years, true history of things that went on. There are people that deny the Holocaust. Can you imagine? I can't wrap my head around that at all, that somebody would be so foolish as not to believe that these things happened. We are going to be reading a chapter a day. On the back of the book, the intro gives you a little insight as to what the book is going to be about. The true life story of a real-life hero. It's World War II. Darkness has fallen over Europe as the Nazis spread hatred, fear, and war across the globe. Kind of sounds what's going on in today's world. The hate that's being spreaded and the fear, and there's wars. But on a quiet city corner in the Netherlands, one woman fights against the darkness. In her quiet watchmaking shop, she and her family risked their lives to hide Jews and others hunted by the Nazis in a secret room, a hiding place that they built in the old building. One day, however, Corrie and her family are betrayed. Oh, there's nothing worse than betrayal within a family. They are captured and sent to the notorious Nazi concentration camps to die. Yet even in the darkest of places, Corrie still fights. This is her story, and the story of how faith, hope, and love ultimately triumphed over unthinkable evil. Today, we're going to begin with chapter 1. I hope you enjoy this book as we read along and learn more about this great woman of faith and her sister, Corrie ten Boom and Bessie, or Corrie ten Boom, B-O-O-M. Let's get started. The 100th birthday party. Sounds like a celebration. I jumped out of bed that morning with one question in my mind: sun or fog? Usually it was fog in January in Holland. I leaned as far as I could from the single window in my bedroom in our building, called the Bailli. It was always hard to see the sky from there. Brick walls looked back at me in this crowded center of Harlem, but I could see a patch of pale sky. Father's bedroom was directly under mine, but at 77 he slept soundly. You're not growing younger yourself, I reminded my reflection in the mirror. I was 45 years old and unmarried. My sister Betsy, 7 years older than I and also unmarried, still had that slender grace that made people turn and look after her in the street. Heaven knows it was not her clothes. Our little watch shop had never made that much money. Below me, down the street, the doorbell rang. I opened my door and plunged down the steep, twisting stairway. Actually, the BG was 2 houses. The one in front was a typical old Harlem structure, 3 stories high, 2 rooms deep, and only 1 room wide. At some point, its rear wall had been kicked through to join it with the even thinner, steeper house in back of it, which only had 3 rooms, one on top of the other, and this narrow corkscrew staircase squeezed between the 2. Betsy was at the door ahead of me. An enormous spray of flowers filled the doorway. We searched the bouquet for the card. "Pickwick!" we shouted together. Pickwick was a wealthy customer who not only bought the very finest watches, but often came upstairs to the family part of the house above the shop. His real name was Herman Slurring. Pickwick was the name Betsy and I used between ourselves because he looked like the illustrator's drawing in our copy of Dickens. Herman Slurring was short, bald, and immensely fat, and his eyes were such that you were never quite sure whether he was looking at you or someone else. He was as kind as he was fearsome to look at. The flowers had come to the side door. the door the family used, opening onto a tiny alleyway, and Betsy and I carried them into the shop. First was the workroom, where watches and clocks were repaired. There was the high bench over which Father had been for so many years, doing the delicate, painstaking work that was known as the finest in Holland. In the center of the room was my bench, next to mine, Hans, the apprentice's, and against the wall, all old Christopher's. Beyond the workroom was the customer's part of the shop, with its glass case full of watches. All the wall clocks were striking 7 as Betsy and I carried the flowers in. Ever since childhood, I loved to step into this room where 100 ticking voices welcomed me. I unlocked the street door and stepped out into the... I can't pronounce this word, but I'm assuming she stepped out into the street. She unlocked the street door and stepped out into the street of other shops. The other shops up and down the narrow street were still shuttered up. The opticians next door, the dress shop, the bakers, wild furriers across the street. I folded back our shutters and admired the window display. It had a collection of clocks and pocket watches, all at least 100 years old, all borrowed for the occasion. For today was the shop's 100th birthday. In January 1837, Father had placed in this window a sign, 10 boom watches. The doorbell on the alley rang, more flowers. So it went for an hour, large bouquets and small ones, and elaborate pieces and homegrown plants in clay pots. For although the party was for the shop, the affection was for our father. Haarlem's grand old man, they called him. When the shop and the workroom would not hold another bouquet, Betsy and I carried them upstairs to the 2 rooms above the shop. This is a picture. Here's the shop, and up above is probably their living quarters up here. And it looks like there's another place up here. And you can see how narrow the buildings up, I think, were very close together. Though it was 20 years since her death, there were still Tan Jan's rooms. Tan Jan's was Mother's older sister, and her presence lingered in the massive, dark furniture she had left behind. At 7:45, Hans, the apprentice, arrived, and at 8, Toos, our sales lady bookkeeper. Toos was a sour-faced individual whose unpleasant personality had made it possible for her to keep a job until 10 years ago. She had come to work for Father. Father's gentle courtesy had mellowed her, and though she would never have admitted it, she loved him as fiercely as she disliked the rest of the world. We left Hans and Toos to answer the doorbell and went upstairs to get breakfast. So there's a lot of preparation going on. They're going to be celebrating 100 years in business, which is very special, very special occasion. Some businesses go out of businesses in 30, 40, 50 years. I set out 3 plates. The dining room was in the house at the rear, 5 steps higher than the shop, but lower than Tandy Jan's room. This room, with its single window looking into the alley, was the heart of the home. We use only a quarter of the table now, Father, Betsy, and I, but to me, the rest of the family was still there. There was Mama's chair, the 3 aunts' chairs. Not only Tan Jan's, but Mama's other 2 sisters had also lived with us. Next to me had sat my older sister, Nolly, and William, the only boy. Nolly and William had homes of their own now, and Mama and the aunts were dead. But still I seemed to see them here. Their chairs had not stayed empty long. Father would never bear a house without children, and whenever he heard of a child in need of a home, a new face appeared at the table. Out of his watch shop that never made much money, he fed and cared for 11 more children after his own 4 were grown. Now these 2 had grown up and married off or gone to work, and so I laid 3 plates on the table. Sounds like a wonderful father and man. Betsy brought the coffee in from the tiny kitchen off the dining room, and we heard Father's step coming down the staircase. He went slowly now on the stairs, but still as punctual as one of his own watches. As he entered the dining room, he had every morning since I could remember at 8:10. Father's hair and beard were now as white as a tablecloth, but his blue eyes behind the thick round spectacles were as mild and merry as ever. He gazed from one of us to the other. "Corrie, dear, my dear Betsy, how lovely you both look." He bowed his head and said the blessing. How could we have guessed, as we sat there, two middle-aged sisters and an old man, that we were about to be given adventures such as we never dreamed of? Adventure and anguish, horror, and heaven were just around the corner. In that room on that day, we did not know. Isn't that true in our lives? We could be having a glorious day and families over, friends celebrating, and we have no idea of the anguish and horrors that will be just around the corner. And especially for this family, something was looming that they were not even aware of. Father took the big Bible from its shelf at 2's, and Hans came in. Scripture reading at 8:30 each morning for all who were in the house was another of the points around which life in the VG revolved. Father turned to the Gospel of Luke, where he had left off yesterday. He looked up. "Where is Christophels?" Christophels was the third and only other employee in the shop, a little man who looked older than Father, though actually he was 10 years younger. I remembered the days years earlier when he first came into the shop, so ragged that I assumed he was a street beggar. I was about to send him up to the kitchen, where Betsy kept a pot of soup simmering, when he announced with great dignity that he was considering permanent employment and was offering his services first to us. We learned Christophels belonged to an almost vanished trade, the clock mender, who trudged on foot throughout the land, regulating and repairing the tall pendulum clocks that were the pride of every Dutch farmhouse. Father hired him on the spot. "They're the finest clockmen anywhere," he told me later, "these wandering clocksmiths. There's not one repair job they haven't handled with just the tools in their sack." People all over Haarlem brought their clocks to Christophels. What he did with his wages we never knew. He had remained as threadbare as ever, though Christophels' most notable quality was his pride. Now, for the first time ever, Christophels was late. Father polished his glasses with his napkin and started to read, his deep voice lingering over the words. Eventually, we heard Christophels' shuffling steps on the staircase. The door opened, and all of us gasped. Christophels was resplendent in a new black suit, checkered vest, and white shirt, tie, and stiff starched collar. "Christophels, my dear associate," Father murmured in his formal way, "what joy to see you." He resumed his Bible reading. Soon the doorbells were ringing, both the shop bell on the street and the bell in the alley. Tooze and I hurried to the doors. Before a long, steady stream of guests climbed in the narrow staircase to Tangen's rooms, where Father sat almost lost in a thicket of flowers. As I helped one of the older guests up the steep stairs, Betsy seized my arm. "We need Nolly's cup right away." "I'll go get them." Our sister Nolly and her husband were coming as soon as their 6 children got home from school. I dashed down the stairs, took my coat and bicycle from inside the alley door, and set it over the bumpy brick streets. Nolly and her husband lived about 1.5 miles from the VG, outside the center of the city. I pedaled there often. How could I foresee, as I zipped around corners, that one day I would stand on Nolly's street with my heart thudding in my throat, daring to go no closer to her house for fear of what was taking place there? Today I careened onto the sidewalk and burst through the door with never a knock. "Nolly, we need the cups right now." Nolly came out of the kitchen, her pretty face flushed with baking. "They're all packed by the door. I wish I could go with you, but I've still got more to bake. You're all coming, aren't you? Yes, Corrie, Peter will be there. I loved all my nieces and nephews, but Peter, well, was Peter. At 13, he was a musical prodigy and a rascal and the pride of my life. The BG was even more crowded when I got back. The mayor of Harlem was there, and the postman, and the trolley motormen, and half a dozen policemen from the Harlem Police Headquarters just around the corner. After lunch, the children started coming, and as the children always did, they went straight to Father. The oldest ones sat on the floor around him. The smallest ones climbed onto his lap. In addition to his twinkling eyes, Father ticked. Watches lying on a shelf run differently from watches carried about, so Father always wore the ones he was regulating. His suit jackets had inside pockets fitted with hooks for a dozen watches, so wherever he went, the hum of hundreds of little wheels went with him. Now, with a child on each knee and 10 more crowded clothes, he drew from another pocket his heavy, cross-shaped winding key, each of the 4 ends shaped for a different size clock. With a flick of his finger, he made it spin, gleaming, glinting. A shriek below told me that Pickwick had arrived. We sometimes forgot who loved him. What a shock the first sight of him could be to a stranger. I hurried down to the door and got him upstairs. He sank his bulk into a chair beside Father, fixed one eye on me and the other on the ceiling, and said, 5 lumps, please. Pickwick loved children as much as Father did, but while children took to Father on sight, Pickwick had to win them. He had one trick that never failed. I brought him his cup of coffee, thick with sugar, and watched him look around in mock conversation. But, my dear Cornelia, he cried, there's no table to set it on. He glanced out of one wide-set eye to make sure the children were watching. Well, it's a lucky thing I brought my own. With that, he set cup and saucer on his own protruding paunch. I never knew a child who could resist it. Soon a respectful circle had gathered around him. Now Nolly and her family arrived. Tandy Corrie, Peter greeted me innocently. You don't look 100 years old. Before I could swat him, he was sitting at 10 Jen's upright piano, filling the house with melody. People called out requests, and soon the whole room was singing. The workroom and shop were even more crowded with well-wishers than the upstairs room. As all through the afternoon they kept coming, the people who counted themselves Father's friends, young and old, poor and rich, scholarly gentlemen and illiterate servant girls. Only to Father did it seem that they were all alike. That was Father's secret, not that he overlooked the differences in people, but that he did not know they were there. I said goodbye to some guests at the door and stood for a moment gazing up and down the street, wondering what was keeping William and his family. I still had a great deal of little sister worship for this big brother, 5 years older than I, a minister and the only Tamboom who had ever been to college. William saw things. He knew what was going on in the world. Much that he saw was frightening. 10 years ago, he had written in his doctoral thesis, done in Germany, that a terrible evil was taking root in that land. Right at the university, he said, seeds were being planted of a contempt for human life such as the world has never seen. Those who read his paper had laughed. On a lot of universities today, there's a great hatred for the Israelites. There's a great hatred across the board for anybody that's different. And this young man noticed that something terrible was on the horizon. Well, those who read his paper had laughed. Now, people were not laughing about Germany. Most of the good clocks came from there, and recently firms with whom we have dealt for years were simply and mysteriously out of business. William believed it was part of a deliberate and large-scale move against Jews, and every one of the closed businesses was Jewish. In Hiversome, William scrimped and saved enough money to build a home for elderly Jews and the elderly of all faiths. But in the last few months, the home had been deluged with younger arrivals, all Jews and all from Germany. These frightened people brought with them tales of a mounting madness. I picked up a fresh pot of coffee in the kitchen and continued with it upstairs to Tangen's room. As I sat down the pot, I asked a group of men, "This man in Germany, does he want war?" I knew it was poor talk for a party. A chill of silence fell over the table. At that moment, William entered the room. Behind him came Tin, his wife, and their 4 children. But every eye in the room settled on the figure whose arm William held. The man was a Jew in his 30s, in a broad-brimmed black hat and long black coat. His face had been burned. In front of his right ear dangled a gray and frazzled ringlet. The rest of his beard was gone, leaving only a raw wound. "This is Herr Gutenberg," William announced in German. "He just arrived in Hilversum this morning. Herr Gutenberg, my father." William continued rapidly in Dutch. Teenage boys in Munich set fire to his beard. That's Munich, Germany. Father rose from his chair and eagerly shook the newcomer's hand. I brought him a cup of coffee and a plate of cookies. How grateful I was now for Father's insistence that his children speak German and English almost as soon as Dutch. Herr Gutenberg sat down stiffly on the edge of a chair and fixed his eyes on the cup in his lap. I pulled up a chair beside him and talked about the weather, and around us conversation began again. And so the shadow fell across us that afternoon in 1937, but it rested lightly. No one dreamed that this tiny cloud would grow, and that in this darkness each of us would be called to play a role. Father and Betsy and William, even the funny old BG. That evening, I climbed the stairs to my room. Childhood scenes rushed at me, strangely close and urgent. Today I know that such memories are the key not to the past but to the future. I know that the experiences of our lives, when we let God use them, become the mysterious preparation for the work He will give us to do. But I did not know it then. All right, that's the end of chapter 1. What starts out as a great celebration ends on a note of deep thinking. William is telling them something is looming. It's evil. Someone in Munich burned off this man's beard. That's pure evil. People that do things like that for sport or at the expense of another, take a life, an innocent life, that thinks that one race is greater than another. That's sad. And we have some of that going on to a degree today. But we're never probably going to face what a lot of people have faced in their lives. Certainly not what Corrie ten Boom faced in her life and her sisters. All right, tomorrow we will start with chapter 2, and the chapter is entitled Full Table. I hope you've enjoyed the chapter 1, the 100th birthday party. All right, everyone, that's it for our reading of The Hiding Place for today. Lord willing, I'll be back on tomorrow with chapter 2. You take care. Have a blessed day in the Lord. Stay safe. Stay loved. And, you know, I love each and every one of you. I'm so glad that you decided to drop by and that you are going to be following along with The Hiding Place. Take care. Bye-bye.